Okay, so we are recording. So welcome everyone. This is our first webinar for the Embryology and PGD Academy. And we had a tutorial last week with some of our students that are taking our certificate, and they made some suggestions of topics they'd like to cover. So we are going to cover these in the next 4 weeks. And we're very interested to hear any other topics that any of you would like to discuss. So our first talk today is about oocyte and embryo vitrification. So if you're new to webinars, just so you know how this works, at the moment, Alpesh and I are the only people who can speak, and we have there'll be over 200 people online with us today. So if you want to talk, there are a number of ways you can do this. You can put your hand up. There's a little hand there that you can click on. There's also a chat bubble, and there's also a Q&A where you can put questions. And we're going to try and answer as many questions as we can. We have a number of questions from you that have been sent in by email. So we want this to be as interactive as we can. One of my main methods of teaching is to always make sure we have a two-way conversation. We don't just want to come here and talk at you. We want to talk with you and hear your questions so we can really make this interactive. So that's our aim for today. So just a little bit first about the Embryology and PGD Academy. So I'm Professor Joyce Harper. I started working in clinical embryology back in 1987 and was a clinical embryologist for 5 years. And then in 1992, I joined the Hammersmith team and Alan Handyside to work on PGD. But in I always get the years confused, 1997, we set up the ESHRA PGD Academy. And in 1996, I set up my first hands-on embryo biopsy workshop. And in the same year, I set up my first master's program at University College London. And I'm responsible for 4 master's programs. And through these last more than 20 years, I've taught many, many people, embryologists, scientists, nurses, clinicians, about IVF. And I wanted to share this knowledge. And this is why we've developed this distance learning certificate in clinical embryology. So a little bit about Alpesh. He's been a really amazing friend of mine for over 20 years. I would absolutely consider him one of the leading embryologists in the UK, if not globally. He's incredibly experienced. And he came in very early with me with the embryo biopsy workshops. And we've been running these together for many years. And then I think 2014, we decided to set up the Embryology and PGD Academy. And Alpesh is a really amazing teacher. I think some of you have met him over the years already, and it's really wonderful to work with Alpesh and develop this education program. So a little bit about the certificate in clinical embryology. It's a very flexible distance learning program. We have developed 8 modules, which I think are essential if anyone wants to learn the full picture of clinical embryology. And these modules have talks delivered by global leaders. People can take the full certificate. So if you're an embryologist working in an embryology lab, you can take all 8 modules. There's online exams, which are all done automatically and individually for each person. There's a logbook that you fill in your clinic, and there's an exit exam, which we're also doing online. You can take just 8 modules exams and the exit exam if you're not currently working in a lab. But these modules are incredibly flexible. So you can take them with or without exams. You could take 1 module, you could take 5 modules, whatever you want to do. So it's also possible for scientists who are not embryologists, nurses and clinicians to take the certificate, to take the module, individual modules without taking the certificate. And our modules are accredited by the Royal College of Pathologists. So I'm not going to spend too long on this because I want to hand over to Alpesh. But these are the 8 modules. So we have the laboratory from gamete to embryo. We have oocyte, sperm and embryo cryopreservation, which we're going to concentrate on in today's webinar. Genetics, pre-implantation genetic testing and prenatal diagnosis, lab design, quality assessment and troubleshooting, clinical aspects of IVF, new technology and ethics of reproductive medicine, gametogenesis and pre-implantation development, and reproductive health. So we have been working really hard to get all these modules online as soon as we could. The first 3 are very complete and are live now. Module 4 is half complete, and we might make this a provisional live module within the next few days. And the other last 4 modules are all at various stages, but I'm pretty sure, for example, module 6 is going to be with us within a few weeks. But we really hope that all the modules are going to be open by the summertime, especially now we've got extra time to work on everything. So we're concentrating on cryopreservation today. So here is module 2, the cryo module. You can see the amazing world leaders we have. We had Barrie Fuller, who's really one of the experts of the basics of cryopreservation. Steve Fleming is going to talk about, he talks about sperm freezing, and Laura Rienzi about embryo freezing, Anna Kobo about egg freezing, Richard Anderson, ovarian tissue freezing, while Saab about the frozen thaw cycle from the clinical point of view, and Abha talks about the freeze-all cycles. So that's the basics of the lectures on the cryo module. We also have videos that we've done in Alpesh's clinic. Alpesh a few years ago set up his own clinic, IVF London. So we have spent time there doing some videos. So we've done oocyte vitrification, blastocyst vitrification, and oocyte and embryo warming. There's also a logbook. So for the first 4 modules, there's a logbook for those doing the full certificate. And the cryo logbook contains log information on oocyte, sperm, and embryo freezing. If you don't do one of these in your lab, I know some places don't do oocyte freezing, then obviously we make allowances for that. So to apply for the certificate or individual modules, we have recently streamlined this. We had made it quite clunky originally. We've now made it so you can go in right now and book into one of the modules. If you pay by PayPal, you can use a credit card on PayPal, you can get immediate access. A banker's draft takes a little bit longer to confirm. So we are also offering a special offer in April where all students can take 1 module for just £100. When they log in and go to pay, they use the code 150OFF. Then modules are normally £250 each. So you would get £150 off. So you'd only pay £100. So we hope that encourages some of you to use this lockdown time in a productive way. So I'm going to come back to this slide at the end, but this is the webinar series here, summary of the next 3 webinars. But I just wanted to also point you to the Embryology and PGD Academy have a YouTube channel. We will record this. As I said, it will be on our YouTube channel and also on the certificate web page. We have a Facebook page, the Embryology and PGD Academy. Quite a few people try to join my private Facebook page. I do keep that for non-work things. I post very little work information on there, but I do have a Facebook page called Joyce Harper Work. And I love this photo of us taken a few years ago with Alan Handyside, Robert Winston, and Jacques Cohen and Eleanor Contongiani, who did the first PGD case ever, and Darren Griffin. It's really a wonderful memory. Alpesh and I also try to do quite a bit on social media. My social media profile is @ProfJoyceHarper. Alpesh on Twitter is alpesh.IVF, and on Instagram is a.doshi2. So we really want to hear about your feedback on the webinar, and the easiest way to do that is either on the chat or on the Q&A. But I am going to try and run a poll at the end to ask you about your feedback. But we'll see how that works. We're not sure about how the technology will actually work. So that's all I want to say. I'm just going to stop sharing and see if we have any questions from anyone at the moment. Have you got any questions? It's lovely. Some of you are putting where you're from, that's great. If you want to put on the chat or on the Q&A where you're calling in from today, that's really wonderful for us to hear. We've got Denmark so far. We've got, where else did I see? Kuwait, Lebanon, Argentina, India. So that's Pakistan, Portugal coming, another India island, Croatia. So welcome. That's really great to hear from you, and from London, not very far at all. So, right, that's wonderful. I'm now going to hand over to Alpesh, and he's going to tell us about, oh, hold on, we've got someone's raised their hand. Let me just check who's raised their hand. I'll just check. So, Manipa, did you have a question? You should be able to talk now if you just unmute your microphone. Manipa, did you have a question? Did you have a question, Manipa? No, okay. If you have, just write it down. I think that might be easier. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Alpesh now, and he's going to give a presentation about optimizing vitrification and warming. Thank you very much, Alpesh.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Hope everyone can hear me. Joyce, you can hear me?
Yep.
Brilliant, brilliant. Lovely to connect with all of you through these tough times, and of course, trying to use these times more productively to keep on top of our academic endeavors as teachers, and of course, as clinical embryologists as well. So just for those who don't know me, my name is Alpesh Doshi. I'm a consultant clinical embryologist. Joyce has given a very glorified introduction for me. Thank you, Joyce. It's very kind of you. And by training, I'm a clinical embryologist, and I've been practicing embryology for over 25 years now. And today I'm going to be talking to you about optimizing vitrification and warming. This is something very close to my heart because I was one of the first embryologists to bring vitrification to the UK back in 2005. And, you know, we had one of the first babies born from vitrification in the clinic I used to work at. So I went and learned vitrification from Japan, from Tokyo, Hiroshima, and various clinics that were at that time performing vitrification in Japan. So I kind of had the privilege to learn vitrification and warming from the experts and the innovators of the technology. So just a brief slide around the advantages of vitrification over slow freezing. I know none of us now do slow freezing, but the advantages of vitrification are far and wide. The whole process is much faster, doesn't require any kind of expensive equipment per se, but of course what is very important is the skill of the operator when it comes to vitrification, because the chemicals that we're using, the media that we're using has got a lot of chemicals or high concentration of chemicals called cryoprotectants. And hence it's quite important to understand that, you know, it's not that you can use indefinite amounts of time, etc. There is a downside to vitrification again as well. And if the skill and the speed is not there, then the whole process can become quite a problem. But the whole idea of this webinar is to learn about the nicks and tricks of vitrification so that you can optimize it in your own setting. So what is vitrification? Well, vitrification is a process that takes a liquid straight to glass and vice versa when we warm. The whole idea with vitrification is you're trying to prevent the liquid to go into ice, because it's the ice crystals that can damage the cells. So through a very rapid freezing and using very high concentration of chemicals, you can take liquid straight to glass. And that little diagram there shows you that within liquid nitrogen, you've seen a drop of PBS there that goes cloudy. That's because it's got ice crystals in there. Whereas the drop on the right-hand side, which has got the cryoprotectants in it, is clear, and yet it has solidified into glass. So that is the whole basic concept of vitrification. Because the ultra-rapid cooling rates, the high concentration of cryoprotectants, both intracellular and extracellular, can aid enough dehydration to remove the water out of the cells and preserve the cells in a glass state. So we all know that vitrification has been around for many, many years. The first pregnancy using vitrified embryos was reported in 1984, and the first pregnancy using frozen oocytes was reported in 1986. So again, it's been around for a while. This is just a brief schematic around Blastocyst vitrification. And again, this specific slide is just talking about the process or the protocol using the Kitazato product, or the Kitazato vitrification kit. So the first solution, which is the ES or equilibration solution, has got typically 7.5% ethylene glycol and 7.5% DMSO. Then you move onto the vitrification solution, which has got 15% ethylene glycol and 15% DMSO plus sucrose. And then once you have taken the embryos or blastocysts through these two solutions, then you would just literally load it on your carrier and vitrify it in liquid nitrogen. When you're warming the embryo, the warming rate is extremely important, and we'll be speaking a bit more about that. So one thing to understand from the physics perspective or the biophysics perspective is when you're vitrifying, you're removing all the water from the embryos by dehydrating it. And the reason why the embryo survives well is because there is no intracellular ice crystals, because the water has been removed. Whereas when you warm the embryos, you need to rehydrate the embryo and pump the water back in. So the whole vitrification process happens via osmosis in terms of getting the water out. And in the warming process, again, whereby the water is getting back into the cells, happens via dilution and diffusion. So again, when you're warming, you first remove the embryo from liquid nitrogen, and with a very rapid technique, you place it into media, 1 molar sucrose media, for about a minute at 37 degrees. But again, if any one of you has any questions about the specific protocols, please do ask at the end of the webinar. It may be very difficult to go through individual protocols of every different company and the products they make, but the basic concepts are very much similar. And I would encourage you to look at the specific protocol for the company of the media that you're using, rather than just a generic protocol applied to different medias. So there is no one size fits all when it comes to vitrification. It is very important that the manufacturer's guidelines are followed. So when it comes to oocyte vitrification, again, I know that there are some more simpler kits in the market which now rely on literally just exposing the oocyte straight to the only one solution of cryoprotectant. We still use, in our clinic, we still use the Kitazato or the cryotop method, whereby we gradually infuse the cryoprotectant to oocytes. Now, oocytes is very different from embryos, primarily because the oocyte is the largest cell in the human body and it has a lot of water. So you really need to get the water out very gradually. The other reason is that the spindle within the oocyte is free-floating, is naked. So it's not encased by any nucleus. So there could be quite a big impact on the spindle as well if the dehydration is not adequate enough. So with oocytes, it is much more technically challenging, but again, when perfected, this protocol can still give you a very high survival rate. But again, I'm sure quite a few of you have got questions around oocyte vitrification and warming, and I'll be very happy to answer that at the end of the webinar. But the gist of oocyte vitrification is gradual infusion of the cryoprotectant, and of course, same concept, taking it through different concentrations of cryoprotectant, loading it on your carrier system, dunking it in liquid nitrogen with a very rapid cooling rate, and we'll talk a bit more about that. When we're warming, it's pretty much the same protocol as blastocysts or embryos. So the most important rule to remember when performing vitrification is that the success rate of vitrification is dependent on 3 parameters. 1, the cooling rate. Secondly, the viscosity of the medium, which is essentially made up by the concentration of the cryoprotectants that we use. And thirdly, the volume. in which the egg or embryo is sitting. That affects the overall probability of success of vitrification. So just to give you a typical example for Blastocyst vitrification protocol that we use in our lab, we use an ethylene glycol and a DMSO based product, as I said, the Kitazato product, and we would literally do the whole process at 37 degrees, and you would place the embryo for a couple of minutes in equilibration solution, and then a minute in vitrification solution, and then finally take them through 3 50 microliter drops of vitrification solution, and place the embryos on the carrier and dunk into liquid nitrogen. And again, if any one of you has any specific questions around the protocol, I'd be very happy to guide you or share the protocol. So the factors that affect the success of vitrification, let's go into them one by one. So one of the most important parameters is the cooling rate. Now, of course, we all know that those of us who do perform vitrification, you have to have liquid nitrogen. The liquid nitrogen cooling rate should be around minus 23,000 degrees C per minute. That is the level of cooling rate we are expecting when we dunk our carrier in liquid nitrogen. Of course, the solution, the composition of the solution, everything will have an impact on the cooling rate. But there are various pointers around how to optimize your cooling rate. And one of them also depends on the carrier that you're using, whether it's an open system, whether it's a closed system, whether whether it's what is the thickness of the plate on which the carrier sits, etc., etc. So again, many factors add to the success of the cooling rate. Now, the next parameter is the viscosity of the solution. The viscosity being the media in which you have the extracellular and intracellular permeating cryoprotectants that make up the viscosity. So the higher the concentration of the cryoprotectants, the higher the viscosity of the media as well. And hence, the higher glass transition temperature, meaning that you will get less intracellular ice crystal formation. So typically, as I mentioned earlier, the vitrification solution, which as you remember, there is ES and VS. Equilibration solution has got a total concentration of 15% of cryoprotectants, intracellular cryoprotectants, and the vitrification solution has got 30 to 35% intracellular cryoprotectants. So again, you know, the concentration of the cryoprotectants are quite high. Eventually, the whole process is still very time sensitive. So the time of exposure to the cryoprotectants also will play an important role in the survival rates. And one of the main factors that I feel are, which is quite important in determining success, and I tend to spend a lot of time when I'm training my embryologists on vitrification, one of the most important parameters that I put a lot of focus on is the loading volume in which the embryo or the egg is placed on the carrier. So in that diagram on the right, or in the picture on the right hand side, you can see that there's an egg there in very minute amount of media. Typically, the volume that we are expecting to release the egg or the embryo in is less than 1 microliter. Now, I appreciate that we can't sit there and measure 1 microliter, and 1 microliter can be very subjective when we're doing the process. But again, practice makes perfect. You really need to try and make the smallest drop, or even if you've made a drop, you need to try and remove all the excess media in which the embryo is sitting. So some embryologists call it the drag and drop, the drop and drag method, whereby you make a drop, then pull a slight extension of that media, and from the other side, just aspirate all the excess amount of media. But the long and short of it is that you want to make the tiniest drop possible in which your egg is sitting. This will influence the cooling rate. This will give you the maximum cooling rate during the procedure. With very high or very large drops, you may be compromising the cooling rate and hence potentially the survival as well. So this was a bit about the open systems. And of course, as you know, we have closed systems in the market available as well. And you know, there's quite a few closed systems in the market. There's RapidEye, there's CBS. Again, the idea being that you want to try and maximize the cooling rates. Hypothetically, an open system has a higher cooling rate than a closed system, because with a closed system, you have the plastic in between, and it's only your air that is super cooled within that straw, and hence can be a slightly lower cooling rate. However, I know for a fact that a lot of the open systems give a very good survival rate as well. I think the skill of the operator is very, very important. And of course, the warming rate is extremely important as well. And I think many embryologists will argue that vitrification still has a bit more of a forgiving element, but the warming is very crucial. Typically, with the warming rate, we're expecting the warming to take place over a very short time period, giving a warming rate of about 42,000 degrees C per minute. And of course, if there is any compromise around the warming, the result will be that your eggs or the embryos may not survive. So what you want to make sure is, it's quite important to keep your liquid nitrogen right next to you with your straws. And then when you're dunking the straw into the 37-degree media, you want to make sure that the distance is very short from your liquid nitrogen to your dish containing the 37-degree media. The first solution is called the thawing solution. Again, one of my friends, Joe Conahan, who's an embryologist in the US, has shown amazingly well that there is a huge learning curve with embryologists when it comes to vitrification and warming. And initially, embryologists could be starting off with, say, 80% survival, but as your drop sizes become smaller, as your speed becomes faster, as your warming becomes more optimized, you can achieve survival rates in excess of 98% for embryos, and typically in excess of 92–93% for oocytes. Okay, so this is what we achieve in our lab, and of course it's quite important to understand that there is a learning curve. And for those of you who are new to vitrification or are training in vitrification, I would highly encourage you to keep the practice going. Look at your data. Once you've done about 50 failed FERT eggs or discarded embryos, then assess what your survival rate is and keep on top of that. Of course, it's quite important to understand that we talked about the size of the drop, which is less than 1 microliter. You want to make sure that the speed of dunking in liquid nitrogen is, again, very fast. Various different media protocols have got very different have got a very different working protocol. So you want to ensure that you try and stick to the protocol and do not deviate from the protocol. Because again, if it doesn't work, you go to your culture media company or the company where you buy your cryoprotective media from, they will probably tell you, well, because you haven't adhered to the protocol. So try and stay within the boundaries of the protocol rather than innovating your own extensions of what you feel may work or may not work. And again, I want to tell you something very, which is something quite important to me. Please don't take our word for it that, oh, it works in my lab, so you can do the same thing. I highly encourage you all to try and validate your own protocols in your own laboratory setting. Because it's such a multifactorial process, it may not just be the product, it may be the skill, it may be the temperature of the lab, it may be your heated stages. You want to validate the protocol in your own setting. Please do not just do it because I'm saying it. You want to make sure that you first do all the trials within your own lab before you apply a protocol clinically. And of course, the success of any vitrification cycle that we do depends on the endometrial preparation. Ultimately, one of the key performance indicators that we're going to be talking about today is pregnancy rates. So it's quite important that your clinician also is quite up to speed with the whole endometrial preparation side of things when it comes to frozen embryo transfers. There's enough evidence now that suggests that a medicated frozen embryo transfer cycle is much more effective in terms of pregnancy rates than natural cycles. So again, have this discussion with your clinicians just to make sure that you're all using optimum laboratory and clinical practices. So one thing I want to talk about, which has been a very personal experience of ours in 2010, when we applied or were trying to improvise the vitrification systems. So one thing that we did after reading some reports that were very new at that time is perform assisted shrinkage. And what this means is apply a laser pulse on the trophectoderm junction of a blastocyst. So assisted shrinkage, by the way, is only applicable to blastocysts. It is not applicable to cleavage stage embryos or oocytes, okay? Because we know that in a blastocyst, we have 90% water in the blastocele fluid, the idea is to drain all this fluid out before vitrification, and that highly enhanced our success rates. And to date, we still perform assisted shrinkage. So what we do is any embryo with more than grade 2 expansion of the blastocelic cavity, we would apply a short laser pulse between the junction of, or at the junction of 2 trophectodermal cells. And the moment you apply the laser, the cavity will collapse, and within 5 minutes, the whole embryo has shrunk and released all the water. So this is when the embryo is ideally ready to be vitrified, okay? So assisted shrinkage is quite an important aspect, in my opinion, that gives a much better survival rate. And again, after warming the embryo, the recovery rate of the embryo is also very fast. Within 2 hours, you get a fully expanded blastocyst again. So just because you shrink the embryo or collapse the embryo, that doesn't mean that the recovery is going to be any slower. But again, some words of caution. Please validate your laser. A laser is a heat gun. So if you have not used the lasers in your lab setting, or you're a bit inexperienced at it, please get some further advice on what pulse to use on your laser, just rather than any high pulse. Because ultimately, if you're going to use a very high laser pulse, it will lead to irreversible damage, heat damage, which can disintegrate your embryo. So you really want to make sure that the laser pulse that you're using has been validated for use. And again, you know, do ask the company that has provided you with the laser that what is the right pulse to use. Okay. If you do not have a laser, then potentially you can puncture the cavity by introducing a ICSI pipette, by literally just puncturing through 2 trophectodermal cells, and again the fluid will come out quite nicely. After collapsing, you want to leave the embryo for 2 to 5 minutes before starting vitrification. So this is just the image of the embryo. So you can see that on the top there, a pulse has just been applied, and within 5 minutes, the embryo totally shrivels up and releases all the water. This is a video that I have, whereby it's a hatching blastocyst. And again, I'm just going to be making the pulse or the laser shot at the top end there, and you can see that it just shrivels quite nicely. Again, just wanted to mention that the laser is always applied at the opposite end of the inner cell mass. Please do not apply the laser shot anywhere near the ICM, because that's what's going to be making the baby. So always go on the opposite side of the inner cell mass when you apply the laser shot. Okay. Another pointer I wanted to give today was post-thaw hatching. So after we vitrify embryos and warm embryos, we also apply assisted hatching after warming. And I appreciate that assisted hatching is a very controversial procedure. Our regulators, the HFEA, also have placed assisted hatching as a no evidence or limited evidence process, and hence class it as an add-on. In our experience, we have seen that when we apply assisted hatching after warming, and specifically because we know that vitrification hardens the shell of the zona pellucida, or it hardens the zona pellucida by making an assisted hatching opening after warming. That certainly, in our opinion, enhances implantation rates. And again, there is some evidence in the literature to suggest how assisted hatching of embryos post-warming helps in achieving better outcomes. So finally, I just wanted to tell you a bit more about some key performance indicators. If you're working in a very busy lab, it is quite important to keep on top of your measures of your vitrification and warming. And how do you, what KPIs can you use for vitrification? And again, alpha scientists in reproductive medicine have published an amazing paper. It's a consensus document that they have published on KPIs for vitrification and warming. I highly encourage you to look at that paper and read it. But typically the KPIs involve monitoring your blastocyst survival rates. If you're getting anything less than 94, 95%, then you've got to set a trigger action there and look at why your results are suboptimal. You want to look at your blastocyst utilization rates as well, which is meaning which embryos you successfully freeze or transfer. That is your utilized blastocyst rate. You want to look at your pregnancy rates, your clinical pregnancy rates, of course, your implantation rates and live birth rates. Of course, these are very common KPIs which are monitored anyway in an embryology laboratory, but it can also give you a very good indicator on how successfully your freezing and thawing program is working in your own lab setting. I'm not sure how things are working abroad, but in the UK, a lot of the clinics are performing almost 80% frozen embryo transfer cycles. And I'm sure this is the case globally as well. So it is quite important that embryologists perfect the whole skill of vitrification and warming, simply because there is a move towards more and more cycles ending up with cryopreservation and frozen embryo transfer. So when does an embryologist need to take an action? I mean, of course, when anything triggers in your KPIs. So for example, if your survival rates of your blastocyst is not good enough, that's when you start kind of digging deeper. Then what is the reason? I always call it finding the needle from the haystack, which is not easy. When things are working well, it's great. We take it for granted. But when things are not working well, it can be really challenging to try and identify the reason for the problem that you're seeing. So in such cases, you would start off by looking at everything from incubator temperature, your gas concentrations in the incubators, your heated surface temperatures, air quality in the laboratory, checking that if there is any malfunction of equipment. Look at your quality of the embryos that are being frozen and warmed. Is it because you have dropped your standards of freezing the quality of the embryos? Are you freezing more BC embryos? Are you getting more BC embryos from the laboratory? Again, it's quite important to do that audit and assessment when things are not working. Above all, you would also start wanting to question individual practitioners. And I can tell you, having led a team of 16 embryologists myself in a very, very busy clinic, it used to be a case whereby all I used to do was troubleshooting. And because quality assurance is a huge part of what we do in the laboratory, we want to make sure that the protocol, the process is standardized so that all your embryologists are doing it the right way, the correct way, and more reproducible way. So it may be a case that your practitioners have a bit of variation in the way they're doing it. Your embryologists need a bit more training. So it's quite important to make sure that there is no practitioner-specific issues here as well. And why just the embryologist? If the pregnancy rates are compromised in a center, then you may also want to look at the embryo transfers of your doctors. You also may want to look at what protocol that they're using for medicated frozen embryo transfer cycles. Are they measuring the progesterone levels before performing the embryo transfer, for example? And all these factors do play a big role. One of the reasons why I decided to start learning a bit more clinical aspects of IVF is because when I started my own clinic 2.5 years ago, I needed to know all these things because I'm now in the, we're in the process of, we hire clinicians to do a lot of the work. But it's quite important that as an embryologist, I also should have the confidence that clinically everything is working spot on and in the right way, and validated protocols are being used. Okay? So again, it's quite important to keep an eye on your KPIs, not necessarily just the lab, but also clinically as well. So in conclusion, I just want to say that we've talked about permeable cryoprotectants today, and of course, I will not sit here and say that this product is better and that product is better. You have permeable cryoprotectants, and examples of those are DMSO, ethylene glycol. It's quite important, and or even propandiol. I know that some products are totally DMSO free and only use propandiol and ethylene glycol. You can you've got to ensure that the exposure time of your cryoprotectants is also minimal and sticks to the adherence of the manufacturer's recommendation. The volume of the media in which your embryo is sitting and released onto your carrier is again less than 1 microliter. This is very important. The rate of cooling is very crucial, one of the most crucial aspects. The carrier systems, again, can be questioned or debated whether you want to use an open system or a closed system. The open system, the risk is that essentially, theoretically, you can have cross-contamination of, specifically in this kind of era, we're talking about viruses and we're talking about bacterial contamination. So theoretically, there is that risk that there could be cross-contamination within liquid nitrogen phase. Whereas if you're using a closed system, that gives you that added layer of protection. The advantage or the disadvantage of a closed system is the cooling rate. Are you getting the cooling rate that is essentially required? And I'm sure there are good closed systems available in the market as well, but that's something you've got to validate in your own lab to see what is the survival rate you're getting. The thawing rate is also very crucial, and we talked about that. More so, I think, than the cooling rate, the thawing rate is extremely important. In my experience, I can tell you that I've had more, when I've been troubleshooting in a laboratory between practitioners, it's always been the warming that has been the culprit. And this is where we need to train our embryologists very intensively on the warming. And of course, as I said, the learning curve is quite important. We want to make sure that every embryologist or practitioner has had adequate practice, exposure, training before they're performing anything clinical. It's also important to try and understand the clinical aspects of the cycles in which your embryos are going to be transferred, and endometrial preparation is also quite important. And finally, KPIs is everything, and you want to be making sure that you've got your finger on the pulse. Assess your KPIs regularly. If you're a very busy center, you may have enough data to assess your KPIs monthly. We used to do them monthly when I used to work in a very busy center. Now I work in a very small center. So again, I do my KPIs quarterly here. But at the clinic I used to work before, we used to typically do 15, 16 egg collections a day, and we used to have a lot of data to analyze. And now we're down to the questions and answers, but Joyce, do you want to add anything at this point?
Yeah, Alpesh, shall we've got lots of questions on the Q&A as well, and Yasmin's raised her hand. I'll come back to in a minute. Should we just do the poll first? Should we try the poll? Now, I don't know if this will work. Maybe Alpesh, you just stop sharing your screen for a minute. Maybe that might help. But I'm going to launch the poll now. So the delegates should all be able to get access to the poll, and you should be able to vote. Yeah, I think it's working because some people are voting now. So there's 2 questions. Which system do you use? Open, closed, not sure. And which type of media do you use? Wonderful. Look at those results coming in. Now, I'm not sure if you can see the poll. I can. So I will read out the results when we're all on. So we've got a few more people that haven't voted yet. If you're not sure, you can write not sure.
We've got almost 191.
Yep. So I'll let a few more people vote. I'm glad the poll is working. As I said, the webinar I was on a few weeks ago, it didn't work. So technology is working. Okay, they're still coming in. There's a few more people, about another 30 people, 40 people. I know we rarely get 100% in these things, but let's see. Right, I'm going to leave it open another 10 seconds. So anyone else who wants to vote? Okay, so I'll read out where we are so far. We had question 1, which system do you use? 59% use the open system, 34% the closed, and we had 8% who are not sure. And which type of media do you use? 13% use DMSO free, and the majority, vast majority of you, 64% use with DMSO. Now we know there's different brands within those. Maybe Alpesh might want to comment. And we had 23% who were not sure. So I'm going to end that poll now. Thank you. That was really useful. Alpesh, did you want to say anything about the results from the poll?
No, I think I expected that. Of course, open systems are still more popular, but more and more people are now converting to the closed system because of the the added advantage of cross-contamination, etc. And there have been quite a few papers that have shown a high survival rate, even with the closed system, quite comparable to open systems. So I know more and more people are moving towards the closed system. I'm not surprised that most labs are still using a DMSO-based media. Again, there's often been kind of statements like DMSO is the king of the cryoprotectants, and that's one of the reasons why people get very high survival rates. And still, if you look at the markets at the moment, most of the media or vitrification media that you get in the market are probably 90%, all of them have DMSO in it. So still, the market leader, so to speak, is a DMSO-based media. So yes, I kind of concur with that.
Okay, I was going to go to some of the live questions now. So on the chat, we've got one question from Rashi that says, if the blastocyst has not regained 2 to 3 hours post-warming, does that say anything about its viability?
Yes, in theory, because obviously you would be under the pressure of wanting to do the transfer as well. And as an embryologist, you want to see viability. Sometimes you may not get expansion, but you will still see the cells as being very, very neat and totally survived. The embryo doesn't seem brown, and hence you might be in a position to say, no, it's not disintegrated. I think that embryo is still viable. The options are to either delay the transfer for another couple of hours. So just as a routine, what we do in our clinic, we always defrost the embryos in the morning, typically by 10 o'clock, and transfers don't happen till the afternoon, i.e. after 2 o'clock. So we give it a good 4 hours. And if after 4 hours we feel that the embryo hasn't re-expanded, then what I would do is I would thaw another embryo. But I would still keep the other embryo that we thawed in the morning, because if it does re-expand, then you can re-vitrify it. But of course, you've got to take a call at that point. And because the patient has been prepared endometrially, etc., you don't want to just transfer an embryo that you're not sure. So I would highly encourage that if there is more embryos to thaw, I would go for another embryo if despite at 4 hours you see no expansion.
Thank you, Alpesh. A question here from our Q&A. Is there a specific dish for vitrification?
Yes, there's a few dishes in the market that are used for vitrification. Companies like Kitazato, they make their own, dishes as well. So, but there's nothing to say that you can't just use the standard dishes as well that we use in an IVF setting, such as your tissue culture dishes. So it's not a must to use the products when it comes to the dishes or the plasticware. I would encourage you to stick with the company, because if you're using one product from a media perspective. You're using another product from your plasticware perspective. If things are not working, what do you troubleshoot? Is it the media? Is it the plasticware? So again, during your validation, I would encourage that embryologists always stick to what products should be used in harmony or in synchrony. Because some of these dishes, and more so, not so much with Blastocyst vitrification, but with oocyte vitrification, the rate of infusion of cryoprotectant is very important. And the dishes that we tend to use for oocyte vitrification have got a conical base. And because the oocytes sit in the bottom of the conical base, there is a larger surface area on top for dehydration to happen. So not for anything else, but purely based on the shape of the well or the microwells that can assist in further dehydration.
Thank you. We've got 45 questions here now, Alpesh, so we might want to make the answers a bit briefer. Do you think we can use droplets with lower volumes, like in the Irving vitrification thawing protocol?
Yes, you can. I would suggest that you do not use micro drops or small drops when it comes to the first step of warming, because that temperature gradient is very important to make sure you get the high warming rate. So my suggestion is that the first step, i.e. when you take the straw from liquid nitrogen to 37-degree media, that should not be done in a micro drop. That should be done in about 500 microliters of media, where there is enough volume there to maintain the temperature at 37.
Okay, thank you. How to confirm about purity of liquid nitrogen?
Very good question. There is no way of confirming that. Some people use a sterilizer or something called enterilizer, which is available in the market. It's a UV lamp, which sits on top of your liquid nitrogen bath for a few minutes to sterilize the liquid nitrogen. But as a routine practice, I'm sure 95% of the labs do not sterilize the liquid nitrogen. And it is very difficult to know what the purity is. If you want, you can potentially take swabs and everything of your liquid nitrogen and send it for microbial testing to see if it's going to grow anything. But again, whether you're going to get anything, because at that ultra low temperature, what can survive?
Yeah, exactly. What is media quantity in case of 2 to 3 embryos on a straw?
Same, 1 microliter. So whether you put one embryo in a microliter or 2 embryos in a microliter is the same. So even if you have 2 or 3 embryos, you still have the trick of trying to put it in less than 1 microliter.
Okay, Rifat asked that question and also then asked, what in the case of Blastocyst media volume? So that's the same. That's the same. Okay. In the actual context, do you consider the closed system to be better?
My personal experience, I have never used a closed system. Well, I've used it for infectious cases, yes. So for Hep B, Hep C positive patients, we have to use a closed system. But as a routine, I have always preferred to use an open system. That's just because that's how I've always done it. And I've got very, very good survival rates with an open system. But I must admit, I haven't personally done a comparison of an open and a closed system. There are quite a few papers out there that have done that study. So you may want to have a look at it. But my personal preference is an open system.
So this one was about how many embryos or oocytes do you suggest should be loaded on a rapid eye vitrification system?
So usually with the whole trend going towards single embryo transfers, because we're trying to minimize multiple pregnancies, as a rule in the UK, we only put 1 blastocyst per straw. Only 1 blastocyst per straw. If it's oocytes, you can put up to 3 eggs per straw. Again, you don't want to, I know carrier systems are very expensive, and in some countries like India, for example, because IVF is quite cheap compared to the West, they try and conserve on consumables. So typically one of these carriers can cost about $20 to $25, and embryologists may be putting up to 8-9 eggs on 1 straw. But again, you've got to appreciate that for that patient, then you have to defrost all the eggs. And if it's a cancer patient, for example, you want to give them the opportunity to just defrost few at a time.
One person's asked about doing a webinar on sperm vitrification, so I've made a note of that. We could probably do that. Do you suggest, we're coming up to 59 questions on here now. Do you suggest embryo collapsing before freezing? Is priming essential during the freezing and thawing procedures?
So, yes, I do suggest collapsing the blastocyst before vitrification, especially if the cavity of the blastocyst is more than grade 1 expansion. The next question was priming. No, when you're vitrifying, you don't prime.
Yeah.
So these are very high concentration solutions. And by priming your capillaries with the next media can pre-expose the embryo to a very high concentration of cryoprotectant. You want to make sure that you minimize the carryover from one solution to the other rather than priming from the next solution. So the answer is no, not to priming, but just minimize the volume of carryover.
Okay, brilliant. This one, it's anonymous, but it said they thought it was a silly question, but I always like a silly question. When placing the embryo on the open system carrier and then plunging into liquid nitrogen in order to vitrify it, is there a risk of losing the embryo? Is there a physical law ensuring that the embryo will stick to the carrier? And if so, what is that? So obviously it doesn't come off, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it. But Alpesh, did you want to add anything to that?
Actually, it's a very good question.
Yeah.
The answer is that if you have perfected the technique of making sure that your embryo is in less than 1 microliter, then when the straw touches liquid nitrogen, you will not lose that embryo. But if, say, it's a 6-7 microliter drop, and just by the action of plunging it, you can displace that drop off the carrier, then it can form a globule away from the straw, and you can lose it that way. But in theory, if your embryo is on the straw, you will not lose it as long as I said, your volume is very minimal.
The next person said about the webinar being recorded, they were a bit late. So just to confirm those, I saw a few people came in late. It is recording, so everything should be fine. We will be putting this on our YouTube channel, which I'll show you again at the end. And we will also be emailing the link to everyone who registered. And it will also go on our embryologycertificates.com website. There's a new field there, which we're just putting on, called webinars and videos. So that will come on there. Do you recommend assisted shrinking of blasts even with Kitiako? I can never say that. Contrary to the protocol? If yes, do you feel that it's required for blastocysts that are over 220 microns? In my experience, 3AA and 4AA, less than 220 microns, may not require assisted shrinking, while those larger than that do extremely well with collapse.
So in a clinic whereby you have quite a few embryologists, so my experience is not that. I haven't come across any data which has shown that AA blastocysts do not need collapse and BB embryos do. So as a generic rule, we collapse all the blastocysts which are more than grade 1 expansion.
Okay, excellent. What about the equilibrium time with Kitiako for blastocysts where assisted shrinkage is applied? Sorry.
I would still stick to the same time for equilibration. So I appreciate the question is asking me that if you collapse the blastocyst, do you still need to keep it for the full 12 to 15 minutes? And the answer is yes, I do. Because again, I don't take any chances in terms of moving away from the protocol.
The next question is why assisted shrinking should always be in Heapy's buffer medium. Can't we do it in the culture dish prior to vitrification?
You can do, but you have to be very fast. The whole reason why embryologists use Heapy's is purely because a lab contains embryologists of various different skill sets, and you can have junior embryologists, etc. So yes, you can shrink them straight into your culture media. I do shrink them straight in the culture media and then carry them over into my freezing dish. But if you have a junior embryologist, that takes a bit longer, then it's same like ICSI. You want to make sure that the ICSI is done in a media which holds the pH. So to hold the pH is quite important.
And why do some patients' embryos have less survival than others?
Sorry?
Why do some patients' embryos have less survival than others?
Because essentially embryos can have osmotic stress during freezing and thawing, and not every patient's eggs and embryos have the membrane stability to sustain the cryo injuries and the osmotic stress. Let's not forget, freezing and thawing is a highly stressful process, highly stressful, and not every egg and embryo will be able to survive this. Now, I can say that potentially the reasons are membrane stability. If the exchange of solutes and solvents is not fast enough, it can really cause an osmotic shock to the embryo.
And I must mention, my children are all born from IVF, and my twins are from frozen embryo transfer. So they always ask me what it means. They still don't quite understand. How many procedures do you consider for monthly KPI evaluation?
It's a very good question. Typically, I think if you're going to do your KPIs monthly, I think you want to have at least 25 to 50 frozen thaws in your clinic. So I would look at that, 25 to 50 frozen embryo transfer cycles. If it's anything less than that, it makes it meaningless. Yeah. So then you'd look at it quarterly.
Since the blastocyst apposition is at the inner cell mass site, would you recommend assisted hatching at somewhere near to the inner cell mass instead of away? No, I agree.
The inner cell mass.
I've always wondered how we really know in the human that is where the embryo implants. I know in the mouse it's the other way around. They say it's the other way around, but I've never understood, how do we really know that? What experiments have people done with human embryos to see how it's implanting? So it's one of those textbook things that I think has come along through the years, but I'm not really sure.
The whole debate about assisted hatching, some people believe that assisted hatching is a laboratory artifact. In utero, there is nothing like hatching. In utero, you get zona lysins being secreted by the endometrial fluid that digests the zona pellucida. So hatching is an in vitro artifact.
Yes, that's a very, very good point. Regarding assisted hatching post-thaw, could this be done prior to freeze at the same time you do the collapsing of the blastocyst?
It can be done, yes.
Okay. How do you assess embryo survival after vitrification? By re-expansion?
Yes.
Good. Okay. We're whizzing through these now. We've got 67 questions, so we've done quite a lot already, but we've only been just over an hour. So those that want to stay, please do. We'll find these really interesting questions. Role of preparing vitrification dish at 37 degrees and keeping it for 1 hour. You mentioned in one of your slides, is this required?
Not necessarily. Again, that slide was specifically relating to the Cook protocol. So the Cook protocol is also the DMSO based product, and Cook recommends warming the cryoprotective media to 37. So that specific slide was based on the Cook protocol and not the Kitazato protocol. So if you warm, basically the message is, if you warm up your cryoprotectants, the timing of exposure is much shorter.
Okay, thank you.
If you have your cryoprotectant at room temperature, then you have to keep your embryo for longer.
Okay, next question. My lab also using Kitazaku. We usually off the heated stage during freezing. So I think it's normally keep it off the heated stage during freezing. Will this affect the survival of the embryo blastocyst? Can you share how your lab performed vitrification?
So it's a good question again. Generally, you will agree with me that when you turn off your heated stage, it takes an hour for it to cool down. So the stage is still hot. So I would suggest that you invest in what we call an ambi plate. A company such as Cooper Surgical, they sell these ambi plates, which is nothing but just a glass plate, which is atmospheric temperature, of course. So you don't have to turn off your heated stages. You just keep this glass plate and you manipulate all your embryos on top of that glass plate at room temperature. So you don't have to shut off your heated stages.
Well done, Abush. For blastocysts that are meant for biopsy, the removal of cell from blastocysts will also result in the removal of water, correct?
Correct.
Okay, good. Regarding the loading volume, should it be higher when we are freezing embryos than compared to oocytes? Should it be the same? Is there any difference at all?
It should be the same, less than 1 microliter, whether it's oocytes or blastocysts.
If you should choose between assisted shrinking before freezing and assisted hatching after warming, what would you choose?
I would do both.
And you could say that. Okay, we have a COVID question. In this era of COVID, how safely can we store sperm, eggs, and embryos? Do we have to screen patients before procedure? IgG, IgA tests for COVID. Should these tests be repeated? And if yes, when? Should we have separate freeze tanks? As far as I'm aware, everyone's stopped freezing anything or doing any treatment. So
at the moment, there's so little known about this that I don't think, you know, we can't extrapolate that it should be treated like a hepatitis B virus. So the answer is I don't know, because what we have been doing in the UK was just stop all treatments. And of course, you know, the idea should have been that you should have never taken a patient through who was symptomatic. So
yeah, I think I absolutely agree with COVID. There's just too many unknowns, so we don't know. But I mean, everyone I've spoken to globally has stopped. So I'm not sure. That was an anonymous comment, so I'm not sure where it's from. Which is the optimal time to start freezing the blastocysts after assisted shrinkage?
Within 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay. Do you think partial zona removal or complete zona removal after thawing gives better results?
We don't remove the zona totally, so we just make a small opening for about 15 to 20 microns in diameter, and that's it. We don't totally remove the zona.
If you do assisted shrinkage and assisted hatching post-thaw, if you have 2 holes, does this increase the twinning rate?
No, because when you're doing assisted shrinkage, you're not actually making a hole in the zona pellucida in theory, unless if it is, that's what you're doing. But when we're doing assisted shrinkage, we are making the hole, we're applying the laser at the junction of the trophectoderm cells, which may not necessarily permeate through the zona pellucida. So at warming, the hole that you're going to be making is much larger than just applying that one laser pulse to collapse the blastocyst. So they have different functions.
Okay, well done. I feel like you should be winning a prize for this, Alpesh. You're doing incredibly well, but we're going to try and get through everything and the questions sent in before. If the embryo is still collapsed after 2 hours of thawing, what does this mean?
It may mean that the embryo may not expand. It may mean that. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that. Sometimes embryos are a bit slower at expansion. One can argue that should this be a measure of its viability? And I think there's quite a few papers that have suggested that if an embryo does re-expand within a certain time frame, then that's supposed to be a better embryo. So what I would do in a clinical setting, as I said, our practice is a bit different. We always thaw in the morning and transfer in the afternoon, which has given the embryo at least 3 to 4 hours. I would probably wait a bit longer rather than before I thaw another embryo. But ultimately, if the embryo has not re-expanded after 3 to 4 hours, I would thaw another embryo, but still watch the original embryo. I must say, I have ended up in those positions, Joyce, whereby I've ended up freezing that original embryo back.
Embryos are funny things, aren't they? Which embryo quality is suggested for freezing? This is always a complicated question.
Yeah. Of course, embryo grading is very subjective, Joyce. So it's important that there is a good EQA, external quality assurance scheme in place in every lab that gives you very standardized and reproducible grading systems within all their embryologists. So in terms of the grading, we in our lab go up to BC, the quality being BC. If it's CC, if you cannot see an inner cell mass, then I would not freeze it.
Okay. I would like to ask your opinion about assisted shrinking by using chemical media. Do you think it is safer than laser or mechanical techniques?
I have never used any chemicals and I don't know what the reference is to. The only ways embryos, I have known embryos to be collapsed is either by laser or by an ICSI pipette.
Yeah, yeah. If open system is used, do you consider the use of sterile liquid nitrogen?
Hypothetically, yes. Hypothetically, yes. If I could, I would love to sterilize liquid nitrogen. But again, this is not the common practice in IVF labs. Not many IVF labs have a liquid nitrogen sterilizer. And if you look at the number of cases that have happened where there has been cross-contamination within liquid nitrogen, it's been very, very rare. So I think from a risk assessment perspective, it's a theoretical risk that, yes, can possess itself clinically, but it's a theoretical risk. The only known, unless I'm wrong, but the only known cases of cross-contamination has been in a blood bank, in plasma bags, where the bioburden is so much higher.
Yeah, yeah. I want to ask your experience and your opinion in day 4 morular vitrification.
I haven't frozen morulars because I just feel that why would you do that? You would then just wait another day and freeze the embryos. But I know that in Sydney IVF that they have done morular vitrification with the same success rates. But I just feel that when you are freezing embryos, you're freezing with the aim to thaw an embryo where you have got the most amount of information about its developmental potential. So if you're going to freeze a morula, how are you going to choose that embryo to thaw back? Unless you're only freezing morulas because you're trying to avoid weekend work.
Yeah. Do you use BS for the Blastocyst vitrification while using Kitazato as it's to be used for oocyte vitrification as per the protocol they mentioned?
So I only use BS as a holding media when I'm freezing blastocysts. So typically when I'm vitrifying, I would not have more than 3 blastocysts dehydrating. So if I'm freezing 3, then I would use the BS to just hold the other 2 embryos whilst I'm taking the embryos down through the concentration gradient.
Okay, I think we're on the home straight now. Looks like we're way over halfway. At what time do you freeze the eggs after oocyte pickup?
Very good question. Oocyte pickup is typically done at around 36 to 37 hours post HCG trigger. Stripping has to be done at around 39 hours of HCG trigger, and freezing has to be done straight after stripping. So around 39 hours of trigger.
Okay, thank you. Very clear. Is there any advantage of using more than 300 microliters of vitrification media, like to fill the 4-well dish?
If you are not using the dishes or the repro plates, for example, which is 300 microliters, and if you're using 4-well nunk dishes, then you may have to use larger volumes because you need to cover the base. Because if you remember, I said the repro plates have got a conical base. So the 300 microliters fills a lot of the well. Whereas in a 4-well dish, because the base is very flat, you may have to use a higher. So if I'm using a 4-well dish, I typically use around 500 microliters.
Will that be expensive?
Yeah, it will be.
I use, yeah.
The dish, or you're saving on the medium?
Yeah. Okay. I use a Kitazato for freezing thawing in my lab, and if sticking to the protocol and the strict recommendations of the company, they forbid using drops preparation for osmolarity variation issues. So I was surprised a bit about the protocol that Dr. Alpesh presented in the webinar. Any comments?
It's a very good it's a very good thing you picked up. Yes, but the drops that I make, and again, I'm not trying to say I'm going against my own advice. In theory, yes, you want to stick to the protocol, which is your retro plate and having 300 microliters of vitrification solution in the 2 wells whilst you're dehydrating the embryos. But what I tend to do is I just make those large drops. There are more than 50 microliter drops of vitrification solution just before I'm taking the embryo into VS. So I make it literally 5 seconds before subjecting. So in 5 seconds, you're not going to get that osmolarity shift. Yes, in theory, you don't want to do that if you're going to be making your dishes ahead of time, But if you're just going to be making literally 10 seconds before taking the embryo through, then it's fine to do that. Because you're not going to have that level of osmolarity shift in that time, evaporation, etc.
Any thoughts on automated vitrification? So there's a big market for this, that people are working on automating the whole lab. Number of my colleagues have been looking into this. We are, one of the talks in, I think it's module 6, will be on automation of the IVF lab. There's some excellent speakers who can talk about this. So we're getting that talk prepared now. But Alpesh, what do you think about the future? I think everything will be automated at some point.
Let's look at it that way. The very limited automated vitrification that is happening at the moment hasn't shown any improvement in success. So automated vitrification may have a place in a very high throughput laboratory, whereby you're trying to remove the human element or subjective element of vitrification. But again, it's a huge faff. There's so many steps involved.
Yeah, I think at some point in the future, maybe not in our lifetime, but maybe. You know, we never thought we'd automate any clinical work, and now we're seeing AI looking at reading MRIs and all these things. So we just don't know. We don't know how. And look how time lapses come on. We don't know.
Just want to add there, Joyce, that I feel that manual vitrification is working so well in its current state that I don't know why a clinic, at least a small clinic, would look into buying all this very expensive equipment.
Exactly. That's always my argument. The cost of these new technologies can be astronomical, and we have to think, why are we automating something? If it's not broken, then don't try and fix it. So we will push up the price for sure. And will we have anything in return? So maybe not. So I think you've already answered this, Alpesh. How many blastocysts would you recommend to load in a single carrier?
Just because in UK, we only do, most of the time, we do single blastocyst transfer.
Okay. Do we vitrify all oocytes, including GV, poor quality oocytes with severe PV debris or SER or any other inclusion particle, dark oocytes with central pitting?
So good question. For patients who are not for fertility preservation, who are not cancer patients, I only freeze metaphase 2 oocytes. For patients who are cancer patients, I would freeze even the GVs and the M1s.
Yeah. Is it a must to use the entire TS file while thawing?
No, it's not a must. You can, what I have, if you're using a 4-well dish, then you certainly need a good 2 mils, 1.5 to 2 mils. You need to keep the well flooded with TS.
Okay. I would like to ask regarding vitrification after biopsy, sample blastocyst. Do I need to wait a few hours, the blastocyst to expand to ensure the embryo is okay, then vitrify, or I vitrify the blastocyst immediately, collapse after biopsy?
Very good question. On the contrary, you don't want to wait. Your embryo has to be vitrified within 30 minutes of biopsy. Otherwise, it will start re-expanding again. And the whole concept we've talked about today is shrinking or removing the water. So when you're biopsying, you're anyway removing the water. So you want to make sure that you vitrify before 30 minutes.
Okay, and we're going to do, we have booked in already with Roy Naga to do a interpreting the reports for PGT, but Alpesh and I obviously have done many workshops on embryo biopsy. So Alpesh, I think we will maybe in May do an embryo biopsy webinar for sure. I think that would be useful. Now, I'm not quite sure the spelling on this. Do you advise conical dish like 6 well of oocyte, or I think that's replicate with warming or vitrification compared to an ordinary culture dish? So I think, do you recommend the conical one rather than the...
I do use the conical ones to vitrify, definitely. So either whether you're using the oocyte dishes or the reproplate, they have the same concept of the conical well. So yes, I quite like the design of those dishes because it keeps the volume together, and in theory, it enhances the dehydration.
Okay. A technical question. If we remove maximum of media after embryo loading, in the thawing process, the embryo can be stuck and it will not be released easily. What will you do?
Yes, very true. But that is actually a good test of how effective your vitrification program is. In theory, you should get that embryo stuck, but you just wait in your TS and you just knock a bit. Obviously, whilst you're still on the in the TS, you just knock your hand a bit and it will come off. But it's absolutely normal for the embryo or the oocytes to be stuck to your carrier when you dunk it in liquid, when you dunk it in TS, your first warming solution. But that is telling you that what you have done is absolutely correct at vitrification. Your embryo should just not fall off, because that means that you may have too much media there.
Okay, right. Let's say we've frozen embryos on day 3, and for certain considerations, we're obliged to thaw and transfer the same day. Do you recommend using post-thaw assisted hatching?
Yes, either way, because in my opinion, and again, this is all up for debate, but in my opinion, it's not whether it's blastocyst or day 3, it's the vitrification that can harden the zona pellucida. And that's why whether you vitrify a day 3 embryo, day 4 or day 5, you still want to make sure that you create that opening there.
Okay, so my opinion is slightly different to Alpesh. I still need the studies to show us this. He's given his experience that it works very well in his lab. But I'm part of the HFEA committee who works on the traffic light system, and looking at the bigger picture, not in a clinic picture, we haven't yet got the studies. So I'd love to encourage people to do some good studies on how we can get this information. So then we could potentially change the traffic light. I would like to confirm whether there's any technique that can be used in the case of attached embryo to the straw and pushing the media around the embryo.
So I think it's the same question that we had before, but what I would suggest, please do not scrape the embryo off the straw. If it's not coming off, be patient, just tap it. That's what you do. Do not use a glass capillary or a polycarbonate capillary to scrape the embryo off. Once the embryo starts taking the water in from your TS solution, it will automatically gain a bit of weight and fall off your straw. Do not be in a rush to dislodge your embryo from the straw. This is where damage happens.
I think you might have answered this already as well. Is it necessary to use the baseline solution to vitrify oocytes?
For oocytes, yes, absolutely essential to use the basal solution for vitrification of the oocytes, and that's what the protocol suggests.
Okay, there's a couple coming up here that I think we've already done. Do you think COVID-19 would survive in liquid nitrogen? No one knows. No, we just don't know. And I think this experiment is not necessary to do now when they have to do so many other things with the COVID. Is it safe to transfer 3 embryos? Is it safe to transfer 3 embryos of day 3 stage? So by safe, do they mean that, I mean, it could result in triplets for sure. I don't know, did you want to add anything, Alpesh?
No, I condemn 3 embryo transfers personally. Yeah. You have the luxury of culturing to blastocyst, so why not wait to blastocyst, unless there's something drastically wrong with the laboratory.
Yeah. My frozen embryo replacement resulted in twins. So is it necessary to thaw 3AA central cavitation and early blastocyst the day before the embryo transfer?
3AA doesn't need to be thawed the day before. 3AA suggests it's an expanded blastocyst.
Yeah.
So the central, if it's a very early cavitating embryos, no, I would still not thaw it the day before. I would just still thaw it on the morning of the transfer with a view to performing the transfer late afternoon. Give it 4 or 5 hours in vitro culture after thawing.
I'm not sure this makes sense. Can we transfer I think it's supposed to be, I think we're missing a word, embryo, after thawing collapsed embryo?
Sorry,
So can we transfer a collapsed embryo? Will it implant?
Well, it can do, because when you say collapsed embryo, building collapsed state is purely because the water has been dehydrated. So when you're thawing the embryo, it is still in that collapsed state. But if you wait for another couple of hours, the water will get back in. So it doesn't matter whether you do the transfer straight away, or you would purely wait because you want to see the viability of that embryo before you transfer.
Yeah.
But in theory, if the embryo is viable, whether you transfer it straight after thawing or later, it doesn't matter.
After collapsing the blastocyst for vitrification, does the duration in ES be altered? If so, how many minutes?
No, so that's the same question we had before, that I still do not change the protocol. We collapse the embryos not to reduce the time in ES. We collapse the embryos to get a much better survival rate. So I still keep the embryos for 12 minutes in ES, even if they're collapsed.
Okay, we have another COVID. Do you think that it's safe to open vitrified embryos in this COVID virus, coronavirus context? What can we do even in negative patients? Are any data on cross-contamination already? I don't know. We don't know.
Data.
We just really don't know. And as far as the ESHRA recommendations, I think ASRM as well, is that we all stop any procedures. So we shouldn't really be doing those at the moment. Mm-hmm. Do you think revitrification is okay for the survival of embryos?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, it's been fine. Yeah. You mentioned about P4 values before ET. What is the optimal value of P4 you follow in your clinic?
So in our clinic, we would prefer a P4 value of 90 to 100.
Okay, right. We're coming near the end now. A little off topic, but what are your tips for your own experience of students interested in this topic? How can we evolve more? Well, our answer is simple. You can take, for just £100 this month, you can take the cryo module. And as I said at the beginning, we've got Laura Rienzi, Anna Kobo, Richard Anderson, and others giving lectures. We will also put this recording, we'll embed it in that module as well, because I think we've included so much important things that will really help that module. So yeah, if you want to learn more about vitrification, I must say when I started in clinical embryology, the cryo was one of the things that made me want to develop a course for embryologists, because I realized we were doing something very technical and I wanted to understand the theory of what we were doing. And with Barrie Fuller's lecture, you will really learn about the whole principles of cryopreservation. I'm sure I really learned a lot, when I've been preparing this certificate from the cryo module. It's really important for any embryologist to hear this. When scoring embryos and its expansion before collapsing, are all labs using a unified system for doing so, or are there more? If so, which is most widely used?
Sorry, I didn't get that question, Joyce.
When scoring embryos and its expansion. So I think this is about grading. Well, grading is very varied.
Yeah, it's very variable. There are very many different grading systems, ranging from Gardner's scoring system, the Lucinda Week's system, many grading systems. Some use their own. So essentially, you want to, A, B, C, D is pretty generic, but the expansion is what can be very variable. So any embryo with less than 50% expansion does not need to be collapsed. Anything more than 50% should be collapsed.
Okay, we're still getting questions added, which is really good. I won't tell you how many there are now, Albish. Kituzatu said that VS medium for vitrification must be at room temperature. What are you doing? Do you put outside the fridge all media, or just use the volume, what you need, and for how long outside in the air?
So we take off a kit for about half an hour before the process at room temperature. And yes, the process that we do currently, because we use Kitazato, we use the process at room temperature. And we don't use one kit per patient, because the Kitazato vials come in larger volumes as well. So we do put the solutions back in the fridge. I wouldn't warm something and put it back in the fridge. So I wouldn't warm from fridge temperature to 37 and then put it back. But it's easily done where you can warm it to room temperature and put it back. Maximum a couple of times, not more than that.
Okay, that was the next question as well. Would you put it back in the fridge? Yeah. So as long as it's not been at 37, just at room temperature, that's fine. So the next question, your opinion about refreezing. What is the survival rate? So, I mean, all the papers I've read, it's very, very good with vitrification.
I wouldn't expect any different survival rate than what we routinely expect as first-line vitrification.
Okay, and these are some questions that have come in during our discussion to answer questions you already answered. Could you explain again why it's not a good option to prime the pipette when you are performing vitrification, please? I didn't get it. I remember with slow freezing, we always prime the pipette, but
vitrification you don't, because the concentration of the cryoprotectant is very high. And because if you're going to start priming capillaries before picking your embryo up, you may subjecting your embryos prematurely for a larger amount of time to higher concentrations of cryoprotectants. So that you do not want to prime that. You don't want to prime your capillaries, but you want to make sure that you just minimize the carryover from one solution to the other.
When did you change your tank of liquid nitrogen? When did you change the tank? So I don't know if that, when did you change your tank of liquid nitrogen? So you don't change the tank, you just keep topping it up because liquid nitrogen does evaporate. But you don't change it. You'd leave everything in there. You don't want to.
Unless the tank is damaged.
Yeah. I've experienced that problem years ago. If I freeze for patient and she come after many years for transfer, but the thawing medium is not similar to the freezing media, that's a very good question. What can I do to overcome this? For example, freeze with Ivan and thawing by Kitazaku media, 2 different media and 2 different techniques.
So, very good question. As a clinic, get embryos from many different clinics because our success rates are quite high with frozen embryos. So we get embryos from everywhere. A lot of the times, it's important to know what the vitrification product that has been used, but it's also important to know as an embryologist what the backbone of these media are. So if you're using a Kitazato product, you should know what's in the Kitazato product. We know that it's DMSO, it's got sucrose, etc. So it helps you as an embryologist choose the correct warming product for it. So yes, the 2 examples you've given me are Irvine and Kitazato. Both of them are compatible. To a certain degree, Kitazato warming is a universal warming, okay, provided the embryos have been frozen in a DMSO-based media. Then Kitazato can be used as a universal warming. Now, Irvine is a DMSO-based media, so Kitazato warming will work fine.
So a few questions here about the day. One says, will you freeze day 4 blastocysts? One says, what do you prefer? Day 3 freeze, day 5 ET, or day 5 freeze and ET?
Day 5 freeze, day 5 ET. And
would you freeze day 4 blastocysts?
No, I would wait till day 5.
Yeah, so day 5.
With some of the medias, you now get blastocysts on day 4 evening as well. But that doesn't matter because you're going to be collapsing the embryos anyway. So you're going to remove the water. So you don't mind however expanded that blastocyst is. You're going to collapse it. So it's not going to affect the survival.
Do I need to collapse fully hatched blastocysts before freezing? And do you have any tips about this? Because fully hatched blastocysts is more sensitive than blastocysts.
Correct. You're absolutely right. They're more stickier as well. But the answer is yes, you would collapse even fully hatched blastocysts. But otherwise, you would pretty much treat them the same way. But just be cautious that they can be quite sticky. But they implant at the same rate. So I haven't seen any lower implantation rate or lower survival rate of fully hatched blastocysts.
Out of freezing, are trifectoderm cells named trophoblast cells also? So we will have a module where we will cover some of this basic embryology. But I don't think it's nothing to do with the freezing, but at some point the trifectoderm cells, some of them differentiate into trophoblasts. Did you want to add anything else?
No.
No, okay. What do you expect to see with embryos previously shrinked in ES? They have to expand during these 15 minutes?
No. So if a blastocyst has been collapsed, you wouldn't expect to see it reinflate in ES. No. Because you've manually removed all the water.
Does GV survival after thaw for cancer patients?
Yes.
If survived, do I ICSI those?
So what we tend to do with cancer patients, and again, this is all we're in the research phase of freezing GV and M1 eggs. But if there's a cancer patient who comes back for a frozen embryo transfer or wants to use her eggs, I would thaw the GVs the day before the ICSI because they need another 24 hours to mature in vitro anyway. It's all up for debate what the fate of these immature eggs is, because there have been some studies done by Helen Picton which have clearly shown that eggs that are immature after administering gonadotrophins have got very high chromosomal abnormality rates when developing into embryos. But again, this is clutching at straws for these patients. As I said, for routine egg freezing, I would not freeze immature eggs, but if it's only a cancer patient, I would freeze immature eggs.
Do you recommend a grade embryo along with poor grade embryo while freezing when we are freezing 2 to 4 embryos in a single straw? Well, Alpers, you said you'd only put one blastocyst in a straw, so...
You are putting multiple embryos. I wouldn't exceed more than 2 generally. But ideally, you want to keep the good quality separate from the poor quality, because just from a choice, which embryos to transfer perspective.
In our lab, we perform a day 4 compact freezing, and then we thaw the embryos 1 day prior to transfer. What are your thoughts? Do you think it is better to freeze at day 5 and thaw at the same day of transfer? Alpers, you said that's what you do. So I don't know if you have any comments.
That's what I do. People only freeze day 4, in my opinion, when they're trying to avoid weekend work. So,
right. Okay. Yeah. And we have to realize, as you said, there's no fixed protocol. Everyone does their own thing and their own variations, and you do what's right for you. There's no right or wrong with this. With any of these things, you should literally...
The problem is that in cases where you freeze morulas and thaw morula 1 day before, and what if that blastocyst is not good quality? Then and you've got 6 other morulas in the tank.
Yeah.
Then you're compelled to only transfer what you have.
How long do you wait after oocyte warming to perform ICSI?
2 hours.
What happened to day 3 embryo that all the blastomeres get out of the zona during TS step?
That means you fractured your zona pellucida, of course, during the whole freezing and thawing. If on day 3 embryos, you have got all the cells coming out, it's not going to, that embryo is not going to do much because you would have probably lost all the individual blastomeres as well. So you may have to go and defrost more embryos. Who was that?
Child which says on the door, do not enter, has entered. Right. While thawing oocytes, should I stick to the exact time of the protocol, even if I notice that oocytes already unflattened?
I would stick to the protocol because with oocytes especially, the dehydration of the oocyte and that takes time. One of the tricks I want to mention with oocyte freezing is that when you have got, say, 6 oocytes dehydrating in ES, then how do you choose which oocytes to take first into VS? You take the oocytes that have reinflated to the same original size. A good way of identifying that is that if your perivitelline space is larger than the thickness of your zona pellucida, then you wait for longer in the ES step. Eggs that have fully re-expanded back to the original volume with the perivitelline space being the same thickness as the zona pellucida are ready to be taken through. So this is just a tip for, so embryologists know which eggs are ready to go to VS and which ones can benefit by staying another minute or two in ES. Oh, I can't hear you.
Yep, almost near the end. Do you use 10% HSA media post-warm?
Yes, just the routine culture media. We don't supplement it with additional HSA. I know there have been studies that have suggested 20% HSA. We just use conventional. But again, anytime you do this, then you're using the product off-label. So we tend not to do that as part of the whole European Cells and Tissue Directives. We're not allowed to supplement media with variable concentrations of protein in the UK. So we just use the ready available product, which is your culture media.
Okay, if we freeze embryo on day 3 and then after thawing go for blastocyst, is it fine? Yes.
Yeah, you can thaw the embryos on day 3. In fact, we often do that if we have patients who are batching embryos because they have poor ovarian reserve, they may have 2 or 3 cycles. We will freeze the embryos on day 3 to get the best survival rate, and then we will thaw all the embryos, culture them to blastocysts, and potentially do any kind of biopsy or so on.
Okay, did 2AA embryo need to be thawing before the ET day?
No, ET day morning.
Yeah. What about the Irving kit? Is it used for both embryos and eggs?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Regarding partial completed hatch blastocysts, day 6 to 7, is there any tip to improve survival vitrification rate?
Partially hatch. Sorry, what was the question? Partially.
Partially. Regarding partial complete hatching blastocysts.
Yeah.
Any tips to improve the survival?
No, I would just make sure that if it's a fully hatched blastocyst, you do not really tamper it too much. You know, just whilst thawing as well, let the embryo come off itself. Even during pipetting, make sure there's enough buffer of media in your capillary to make sure it doesn't stick, because they are more prone to sticking. So just make you handling it a bit more sensitively during all the movements. But apart from that, there's not much you can do.
Can we perform post-thaw assisted hatching using an injecting needle and not the laser?
It's going to be difficult because the only thing you can do with an ICSI pipette is purely just shrinking. You wouldn't be able to make post-thaw hatching with an ICSI pipette.
Okay, Vitrolife suggests priming during freezing in egg and embryo protocol.
Okay, I mean, I'm not sure about that, that protocol, because we don't use them. But again, just something to note, Vitrolife protocol does not use DMSO. And we know that DMSO, although being the king of cryoprotectants, is a very toxic cryoprotectant. So for Vitrolife, it may be fine to prime the capillary because it doesn't have a very toxic cryoprotectant. Whereas with Kitazato and Irvine, there is DMSO. So priming is not recommended because DMSO exposure ahead of time and for too much longer can be detrimental.
So there's a few questions about the tanks. Someone asked, do you clean the tanks annually? And then the question about the liquid nitrogen, not the tank. I can't remember what the original question was, but I think it's about replacing the tank or replacing so it's about cleaning. You don't clean anything.
Because how do you risk assess moving all the samples into a new tank?
No, you can't. You can't.
Drop something. So no.
No. And if you take the embryos or the eggs out, so the chance of the change in the temperature is too risky. Is it necessary to sync the embryo thawing time to the progesterone injection time to match the endometrium?
Good question. We actually give it full 6 days of progesterone exposure before transferring the blastocyst back. So day 0 if we usually encourage our patients to start taking progesterone around midday, and we would do the transfer anytime after midday on day 6 of progesterone exposure.
Okay, what is your experience of de-vitrification of slow frozen embryos? Do you alter the protocol?
Sorry? What?
So I think A de-vitrification of slow frozen embryos. If they're slow frozen embryos, you have to thaw them in a slow freeze method.
Yeah, you first have to thaw them using the slow thawing method, and then if you're left with any extra embryos, you can vitrify them.
Okay, we're on the home straight. We're very near the bottom now. What are the criteria of universal warming media which I can use in case I do not know the vitrification media used?
Well, to a certain degree, you need to know what the product is that has been used. Is it a Kitazato product? Is it a Irvine product? Is it a Vitrolife product? Because you need to know the commercial name of the kit that has been used at vitrification. Once you know what that commercial kit at vitrification was, you can work out what is a safe universal thawing kit. Otherwise, you can be in trouble because you thaw the embryo. If you use the wrong kit, they will degenerate, all of that.
Yeah. What about delayed embryos, freeze or not?
I have frozen blastocysts up to day 7. It's very rare that you get blastocysts day 7, but there have been studies that have shown euploid embryos in day 7 blastocysts as well, although this is rare. So we, as a clinic, we always culture the embryos up to day 7.
These two are relating to freezing at different times. Can you freeze day 6 blastocysts, hatched or not? Do you freeze day 5 and day 6 blastocysts?
Yes, we freeze day 5 and day 6 blastocysts, and even day 7 sometimes.
Yeah. How would the survival rate of fragmented embryos be, considering all the embryos that for that patient are fragmented? So if all the embryos for that patient are fragmented.
Well, so interestingly, vitrification has shown that the quality of the embryo does not determine the survival rate with vitrification. With slow freezing, that used to be the case. With slow freezing, if the embryo was poor quality, then the chances of those cells surviving was slim. But it's rubbish in, rubbish out. So that kind of concept. If you start off with poor quality embryos, fragmented embryos, then my question would be, why are you freezing on day 3? You should wait to blastocyst. And if you don't make blastocyst, then you have your answers. In the UK, as I said, predominantly, we only freeze blastocysts, unless the patients are having what we call multi-cycle packages, whereby you're storing at day 3 with a view to throwing all the embryos out. But in answer to the question, with vitrification, whether your embryo is fragmented or not, that will not affect the survival rate. It will still survive at the same rate.
Right, we are on the last few questions. What about day 7 embryo freezing? Does it survive well? And what about the rate of pregnancy? So,
yes, it does. I couldn't tell you about the rate of pregnancy because it's very few that you do this. Yeah. But I think there's some papers that have been published on day 7, freezing, thawing, and pregnancy. So maybe you want to just look at the literature around that.
Okay, last few. Will suboptimal media decrease the survival rate of embryos and blastocysts?
Yes, of course. If suboptimal freezing, thawing media can affect your survival in a huge way, huge way. So that's why the vaccine is very important.
Yeah, we can freeze embryos from thawed oocytes. Yes. With the Irving kit, can we thaw all embryos frozen with other kits? So I think you've said that. You have to know. It has to be compatible. Yeah. In our clinic, we offer transfer on fresh. When the blastocyst is starting to hatch after biopsy, could we provoke collapse in order to prevent completed hatching? Would it be too risky? We do not have good survival rates for these type of blastocysts.
I know.
Let it hatch, wouldn't you?
I don't get that. What the question?
When the blastocyst is starting to hatch after the biopsy, could they collapse it to prevent it hatching? Just let it hatch.
So as a part of the biopsy, you would have potentially collapsed the blastocyst anyway.
Yeah. So yeah. How long will we get access to module if we register in April? So just to say that all the modules are open permanently. So once you register, you do everything in your own time. We realize some people can do things quickly. Some people do a module in a few weeks. and some people take longer. We've had people be on maternity leave in the middle of a module, whatever. It doesn't matter. So you register and then you take the module at your own pace. This is the last question on here. Then we're going to answer the questions on Alpesh's slide. If day 5 embryos reach early blastocyst stage, should I extend culture time or freeze it on that day immediately?
So I would say that if you do have blastocysts that have got at least, so for freezing embryos on day 5, aim to freeze embryos that have got more than 50% expansion. If the embryos do not have more than 50% expansion, i.e. early blastocysts, leave them till day 6 and then freeze them. Because it's quite important to look at the quality of the embryos. Just by getting 20–30% expansion is not going to give you an indication about the quality of the embryo. So it's quite important as an embryologist to look at what is the grade of the trophectoderm and what is the grade of the inner cell mass. And you'll only be able to grade them accurately if you have the expansion. So let them expand, not for anything else, but just to give you an idea which embryos are better.
Okay, we've got one person's hand up, and then we'll go. Some people emailed in a little late, so I'm going to Alpesh. We're almost at 2 hours, so I'm going to we'll email those last few people. But Alpesh has got, some people had their hand up, but their hands have gone down. So I think we've answered their questions. So to finish off the last few minutes, we'll go back to Alpesh's slides. His last slide was a few questions that we had in earlier.
Yeah, can you see my slides there?
Yeah, so some of these may well have now already been answered. We can just go through them quickly.
Okay, one of the questions was, what are the possible cryo injuries on gametes and embryos? So cryo injuries could be osmotic stress or manual injuries during the freezing and thawing process. So again, as I was saying, we've talked quite a lot about the different possible areas where you can damage eggs and embryos during the handling. You could be creating an osmotic shock for them if you're not using the right media or ineffective exposure times in the cryoprotectants. You could be doing damage to your embryos via pipetting, and ultimately, as I said, if there's an osmotic shock, the embryos will survive. So that's the answer to that. Can we load 2 early blastocysts on one cryotop? Yes, you can, but potentially it's only if you want to transfer both of them back. Otherwise, we recommend that you freeze singly. And whether day 7 vitrification is recommended, as I said, yes, we do this clinically, and we've had pregnancies as well. What is elimination criteria to exclude oocytes from vitrification? We don't freeze any immature eggs for patients who are not freezing for cancer reasons. Again, if the eggs are metaphase 2, then we would freeze them. So what I would tend to do, I would freeze the nicer looking eggs, like with a clear cytoplasm, nice polar body, and make a clear note of which straws have those nicer eggs. And the angry looking eggs, like a very granular cytoplasm or a very fragmented polar body, I would also make a note of them. But I would freeze all the eggs. Can oocyte with fragmented polar bodies be considered for freezing? Yes, they can. But if you're getting too many oocytes with fragmented polar bodies, you want to be looking at what is your timing of egg freezing. Are you leaving them too late? Ideally, at 39 hours post-trigger, you want to be freezing. And we know that polar bodies fragment with time, so it may be that you're leaving the oocytes for too long before you freeze them after egg collection. I have seen that oocytes after vitrification having lower survival along with fragile and degeneration rates. Again, I would kind of guide you more towards optimizing your oocyte vitrification procedure. There are some tips and tricks there. It's quite important to make sure that the eggs are fully dehydrated and re-expanded to the original volume. So I spoke about how to ensure that the egg has fully re-expanded to its original state before you start taking it into the vitrification solution. So please bear note of those few points and see if that improves your survival rate. Egg vitrification is very, very technically challenging, and to perfect it, there's a lot of work that goes in it, okay? But once you've got it right, rest assured you will have very good results. I would really appreciate any tips and tricks that you could give us in order to achieve better results, specifically with the blastocysts are partially completely hatched. I think we've talked about this. In our lab, the protocol is to perform PGTA and transfer embryos on fresh, finding really challenging the vitrification on day 6-7 if we have any surplus. So in the UK, we do not do any fresh transfers after biopsy. We always freeze the embryos after biopsy. We do not do any fresh transfers. And again, I think maybe as part of this webinar, you have got a few more tips and tricks on how to optimize your blastocyst vitrification. But again, if there's any other specific query you have, or I haven't understood the question, please feel free to email us. I recently was involved in an interesting case of a woman, 28 years, who was detected with colon cancer. She had one IVF baby and was looking to have oocyte cryopreservation. It was a first for our unit, and the lab chose to go with ovarian section freezing. Would it be better to offer women ovarian tissue or oocyte cryopreservation? It's important to firstly understand that what is the cancer. If it's an estrogen receptive carcinoma, then you can't use gonadotrophins to stimulate the women. However, you can use certain clinical protocols which are tamoxifen based, not necessarily gonadotrophin based. So my answer to that question is that I would still prefer to do oocyte cryopreservation in women who are who have periods and are not underage. Obviously, the question arises for prepubertal girls, what can you do? And the only thing you can do for prepubertal girls is ovarian tissue cryopreservation. But if you have women who have normal menstrual cycles, you can do egg freezing, and essentially egg freezing has better outcomes. But please be aware of the type of cancer and what drugs that can be used. What do you think about using one brand of media for vitrification and warming and another brand for embryo culture? Would you recommend to stay with the same brand, or does it matter? So that's a good question. What you're essentially asking me, that can you use one suite to freeze and thaw and a complete different suite to culture? So in my lab, I use Sage one-step media to culture the embryos, and I use the Kitazato to freeze and thaw. So you don't really need to worry. Yes, because during the culturing system, the osmolarity and the pH and temperature are very, very important. But when you're freezing, essentially you're creating a big osmotic shift anyway. So there is no rule, in my opinion, that suggests that if you are using a culture media from Cooper Surgical or Origio, you have to use only their vitrification product and not the other. But again, I would, tread with caution. Of course, you've got to, I've known many people using Vitrolife media, but freezing in Kitazato. Kitazato is one of the most popular vitrification products, and Kitazato culture media is hardly used. So that effectively tells you that Kitazato seems to be a more preferred vitrification warming product, but not necessarily for embryo culture. What do you think about using? Yeah, we've done that.
I think that's everything, Alpesh. Alpesh, should we just put the screen back? We've lost a few people, but I just wanted to do a quick poll now. A lot of people have given very complimentary comments about the talks and about how they've really enjoyed it. And here now you should have a poll to tell us, did you find this webinar useful, very useful, quite useful, okay, or not useful? So I'll just leave that on. Oh, we're being all quick now, good. So that's wonderful so far that people have found this very useful. Just 10-11% found it quite useful. I'm very happy with that. We've got a few more people. We'll leave them a few more minutes. Okay, I'll probably stop there. So that's excellent feedback. I will end the poll now so we can. So we had 90% thought this was very useful. Thank you very much. I'll just share those results with you. Right. So Alpesh, you've done an amazing job. I'm going to reveal to you now that you had 108 questions. I didn't want to tell you as we were going through. I think you did an incredible job to answer 108 questions, and the ones on your slide. So I think that's amazing. We've been almost exactly 2 hours. So I just want to finish the session by confirming that we are happy to have any more feedback. Please email the Academy for any other feedback. And just to confirm that you will all get the link for this webinar. It's very long, but I hope to get it uploaded to YouTube tonight. My kids are going to have to let me have some Wi-Fi. I might have to do it tomorrow morning. And that we will, if there's any questions we didn't answer, there was maybe 1 or 2 that came late or on the chat, please email us and we will cover that. But I'd like to thank Alpesh for doing an amazing job there on your brilliant talk and wonderful questions. And thank you all for listening to us today. And thank you for staying with us for 2 hours. Well done. And we're open to any suggestions about future webinars. We've got the 4 listed here. We're going to do one on embryo biopsy for sure, maybe one on sperm freezing. So lovely to hear from you. I will email all of you within the next day or so with the link and many more questions. So thank you from myself and from Alpesh, and we hope to see you next week. We will email you all the login details, so you don't have to email us. We will email. Anything else to say before goodbye, Alpesh?
No, just wanted to say that, of course, thank you to all the participants who spent a lot of their valuable time listening to us. We have a series of other webinars, as Joyce mentioned, and I think on the 22nd, we've got one on ICSI, PISA and TZ. So that will be quite interactive. Again, send your questions ahead because it helps us prepare exactly when we know what questions are coming our way. So thank you, everyone, and lovely to interact. And it's been absolutely a pleasure for me. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got one person with their hand up, so I'm going to quickly let Abdullah, if you want to unlink your mic, unmute your mic, you could add any comments. Did you want to say a last word? You had your hand up, no? No, okay. I think we'll end it there. So thank you all. And I will put this up on YouTube very soon and see you next week. And thank you, Alpesh. Bye-bye.